Welcome to Unit 4, The Modern World, Lesson 23, Between World Wars. The war to end all wars created the reactionary art of Dada. The machine age, science, and the study of the subconscious gave rise to Surrealism, Cubism, and de Stijl. Art between world wars reveals the developments in art as a mirror of social conditions. The objectives for this lesson are to describe the effect of World War I on the art of the 1920s and 1930s. Explain Dada's use of the ready-made and photomontage as forms for social critique. Identify the interests, visual characteristics, and techniques associated with Surrealism. Recognize how artists after World War I took Cubism in new directions. Compare the artistic and social interests of Constructivism, de Stijl, Bauhaus, and the International style in architecture. Contrast artistic styles used to communicate political ideas, and distinguish the interests and influences of artists in Latin America and the United States in the years between the wars. The outline for this lesson: Dada, Surrealism, expanding on Cubism, building a new society, Constructivism, de Stijl, International style architecture, political expressions, Latin American modernism, American regionalism, African American modernists, and organic abstraction. The first movement we'll be going over in this lesson is Dada. Dada was started as a reaction to the madness of war, especially what was going on with World War I at the time when Dada was conceived. World War I was called the war to end all wars. If you know your history, it was trench warfare, a lot of death, a lot of disease actually because of the way they were still fighting. It's kind of the transition phase where we were still a little bit fighting our wars in an old-fashioned sense and moving on into the modern age. So in a sense, Dada artists were using art as a weapon against war. Dada as an art movement was not as much in revolt against art institutions in a sense as it was to the larger aspects of society and government and war, in which the Dadaists found that there was moral decline. Also, besides being a form of political protest in a sense, Dada really did transform the way conceptual art was being made. One of the founding members of the Dada movement was Jean Arp, also known as Hans Arp. The image on the right of your screen is titled Collage with Squares, arranged according to the laws of chance, made between 1916 and 1917. The composition of this work by Arp was completely assembled in a random fashion, meaning that a lot of responsibility of the artist has been removed. You can simply just place objects on a piece of paper, and there it is done. Remember the ready-mades by Marcel Duchamp that we've spoken about before, like the urinal, that also had some of the same concept going on with it. One of the quotes from Jean Arp is, "While guns rumbled in the distance, we sang, painted, made collages, and wrote poems with all our might. We were seeking an art based on fundamentals to cure the madness of the age and find a new order of things that will restore the balance between heaven and hell. We had a dim premonition that power-mad gangsters would one day use art itself as a way of deadening men's minds." What's really interesting about Jean Arp's statement is that this was a premonition of what would happen to him in the 1930s when the Nazis would consider him a degenerate artist and they banned his artwork in Germany. One of the most thought-provoking artists from the 20th century was Marcel Duchamp. We've covered him several times throughout lessons in this course. This is his LHOOQ, which was a basic defacing of the Mona Lisa from 1919. LHOOQ is an abbreviation for a vulgar French slur, which, when translated, means she has a hot tail. Duchamp was always trying to challenge individuals into stepping outside of what was the norm and what was acceptable. This was equally applied to the values of the society at the time, and also there is a slight thumbing of the nose at the art institutions. This is a replica from 1958 of Man Ray's The Gift, which was originally made in 1921. Man Ray is known more for his photography, but he was a full participant in the Dada movement, and many of those artists crossed boundaries, so to say, in experimenting with other art media. This is a work that would fall into the irrational category, in a sense that it's an iron meant to iron clothes, yet it has nails on it which would completely tear up the clothes. Even though when this work was originally made in 1921, World War I already was over for a few years, there was a serious downturn in societies all over the world, especially in Europe. Fascism was on the rise, as well as Nazism was soon to be coming around the corner in Germany. Dada art was also significant because it started up all these partnerships across the world that really hadn't been seen much in art before. If you pay attention to the artists that we've looked at so far, Jean Arp was from Switzerland with the Dada movement there. Marcel Duchamp was part of the Dada movement in Paris. Man Ray was part of the Dada movement from New York. And Raoul Hausmann was part of the movement in Berlin, Germany. This is a sculpture by him titled The Spirit of Our Time from 1919. This work is a commentary on man's obsession with playthings, in particular those of modern technology. Of course, this work was made in 1919, and the objects that are mounted on the mannequin head may look a little old-fashioned, but they were definitely modern for the time. Maybe if this was made in modern times, there would be iPhones and video games and other little gadgets attached. The early collage works from Cubists such as Pablo Picasso paved the way for photomontage, which was a technique used by artist Hannah Höch. In this image, the multimillionaire from 1923, it's basically cutouts of photographs assembled into new meanings. She was really criticized for doing works like this as not being original, seeing that she was using images that had been created already. But in a sense, that does fit in with the sensibility of the Dada artists of the time. The art of the Dadaists dealing with irrational thought and the publications of psychologist Sigmund Freud led to the Surrealism movement. Surrealism officially started in 1924 with a manifesto written by poet and artist André Breton. Breton defined the purpose of Surrealism as the future resolution of these two states, dream and reality, which are seemingly so contradictory, into a kind of absolute reality, a surreality, if one may so speak. So much of the work you'll be seeing by Surrealists deal with the subconscious mind, dreams, other things that have really conflicting ideas going on in them sometimes. This is a painting titled The Horde from 1927 by artist Max Ernst. Max Ernst was a Dadaist. He exhibited with the Dada artists in the early 1920s. He transformed into Surrealism like many of the other artists did, and a lot of his work dealt with nightmares. Some theorized that his nightmares involved some of the things that were going on during World War I. He was a soldier and he fought during the war. No other artist is associated more with Surrealism than Salvador Dali. This is his famous The Persistence of Memory from 1931. Many of the images used in Salvador Dali's work came from his dreams. He was known for keeping a notebook by his bed so he can jot down what his dreams were when he woke up in the morning. Dali also brought more attention to surrealism than anybody else. He wasn't only a painter, he was a sculptor, a filmmaker. There were also surrealist performance pieces as well. Dali was quite a character. He was known for acting out and unusual in public sometimes, keeping up with his surreal persona. Despite that, though, he was very well respected by artists in the film industry, such as Alfred Hitchcock, who worked with him, and Walt Disney. Disney and Salvador Dali never finished their project together while they were still alive, but eventually was remade recently. The missing pieces were kind of animated in a modern fashion to go with the old footage. In the last years of his life, unfortunately, Salvador Dali got involved with a little bit of a scandal. If you consider his age at the time and the fact that he was always quite an unusual individual, he may have been losing himself a little bit in the end. But when we went over talking about prints early on in this course, we talked about editions and how artists create limited edition pieces. Well, Dali wound up getting involved in a controversy where someone approached him with blank pieces of paper and he signed his name, meaning that anyone could come in and print what they wanted, and the artist really didn't have any supervision. This caused a lot of art to be devalued in his last years of life, and it's sometimes difficult for the people to wind up authenticating their pieces now. Most of the work is from the late 70s and early 80s that were involved in the controversy. This painting is by Joan Miró. It is titled Woman Haunted by the Passage of the Dragonfly, Bird of a Bad Omen, from 1938. Miró participated in a slightly different process in surrealism, still dealing with the subconscious, but an automatic process called automatism, meaning that artists would draw and lay out lines with no specific intent, and then later, in an automatic process, just try to bring these things to life that they have created. So these, in a sense, are beings from the subconscious and not anything that resembles something in real life. Other aspects of surrealism, when you look at Salvador Dali's work, for example, you can recognize the objects, locations, and such that are in there, but it's these relationships, juxtapositions of things that don't necessarily go together that makes his work stand a little bit apart from what Miró was doing. This is an oil painting by René Magritte titled Portrait from 1935. Magritte was also a surrealist. He handled things painting-wise similar to Dali, not in a philosophical sense, but in the realistic rendering of the objects on the table. The difference between the two is the paintings from Dali tend to be very fantastical and dreamy. Magritte always took normal situations and turned them on their head in a way, say by adding an eyeball in the center of a piece of ham. You can say that something only like this would happen in a dream, but it's represented in a much more natural fashion, as if you would be sitting out at the dinner table, and having this stare back at you can make things quite unsettling. In this slide, we have an earlier example of René Magritte's surrealist work from 1928. This is The Lovers. We're now going to go over a few artists that expanded on the ideas of Cubism in the teens and 20s. Kazimir Malevich expanded on Cubism by incorporating something he called suprematism, which is the superiority of shape and color over subject matter within a painting. He also had an appreciation for the futurist. You can see by the title, Supremacist Composition Airplane Flying. This is dealing with airplanes instead of automobiles like the futurists did. Another contribution to Cubism by Malevich was the oversimplification of the shapes in the painting. They become more about the idea of something without trying to convey to the viewer exactly what that idea is. They're just a simplification of forms and an idea. Another painter inspired by the Cubists was Fernand Léger. This is The City from 1919. He was also interested in fracturing the space like the Cubists did, but there's more recognizable aspects of this painting as city life, but it's not formed in any logical fashion, as if a photograph of a city would represent where the streets were and everything. You've got the objects and the sense of the city in this painting by the scaffolding, signs, lights, billboards, stairs, other things that represent the city. This is a photo of two strips of film from Léger's Ballet Mécanique from 1924. Besides being a painter, he also experimented with filmmaking. If you watch the short film, it crosses somewhere between the lines of being a Dada film, that there's really no narrative, it's random things, one on top of each other, but it's really a foreshadowing of some of the subjects that the surrealist filmmakers such as Salvador Dali and Louis Buñuel would be dealing with later on. The next movement we'll be looking at is constructivism. It began in Russia and was inspired by the suprematist art of artists such as Kazimir Malevich, who we just went over. Constructivists were also inspired by the Cubists, that they were rejecting the traditional sense of space, and they were abstracting forms, but they were more concerned also with shape and color, such as Malevich was. This is a painting by Lyubov Popova titled Architectonic Composition from 1917. She was a constructivist, dealing mostly with shape and color, but also going on with what was happening in the world at the time. There's a general desire by artists to seek order in the mind as well as in society, and they try to perpetuate that by their philosophical ideals within their painting styles, such as Popova did. Many of the constructivists had a background in graphic design. Much of graphic design has that sense of order about it that the constructivists also incorporated into their work. It's a sense of discipline. Alexander Rodchenko was also a constructivist. He designed this working space, which is in this photograph a view of the Workers' Club, which is originally exhibited at the International Exposition of Modern Decorative and Industrial Arts in Paris in 1925. Designers like Rodchenko felt that if you design an efficient space, you will get an efficient worker. We are now continuing with the ideas of order and simplification with sophistication with Destil. This painting is by Piet Mondrian, titled Tableau 2, with yellow, black, blue, red, and gray from 1922. Mondrian was a leader of the Destil movement and was heavily concentrating on a universal order of things. Conceptually, he was trying to equivocate this with the sense of order that we find in nature. This, of course, in no way represents nature to what we naturally would think it would be. So the use of simplified lines, shape, and color were a heavy part of the work of the Destil artists. Also, they had the tendency to use a lot of primary colors that were unmixed to kind of emphasize that order and purity. We've discussed international style architecture before. It was around at the same time as the Destil artists, and the concern also was on order, space, function, and design. This is an example of international style architecture. It was designed by Gerrit Rietveld, called the Schroeder House, from 1924. If you look at the design of the house, it's very similar to the painting by Piet Mondrian that we just looked at. Simplified shapes, a universal order and flow to things. This building was designed for the World's Fair in Barcelona, Spain in 1929. It's the German pavilion by Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. We've also spoken of him before. He was a leading proponent of international style architecture and a big part of the Bauhaus movement. Here we have a boxy yet open space with all the windows. Van der Rohe just didn't want the people inside to feel boxed in. We're now moving on to political protest, which crossed over into different movements, but it's important to look at it, seeing that it was an important aspect of what was going on in society at the time between world wars. We've discussed this painting before back in our lesson on drawing, talking about how artists come up with the compositions and concepts within a work and how to lay it out. I also went briefly into a description on the political protest aspect of this painting, so I decided to take that part from our drawing lesson and put it back in just for a little bit of a refresher. In this painting, Picasso is trying to capture the horror of an event that happened in a small town named Guernica in Spain. Franco, the leader in Spain at the time, had let the Nazis basically practice bombing raids on the small town, and many people were killed as a result. Occasionally with political protest art, it can take on a negative connotation when looked at with modern eyes. In this slide we have the Monument to the Proletaire in Agriculture from 1937 by Vera Mukina. This is a communist sculpture praising the communist ideal of the worker, man and woman, working side by side to create a better country. The hammer and sickle up on top are symbols of communism. Now, of course, this was all turned on its head, and communism, which started off to be an ideal to keep everyone equal, was an oppressive culture and did not keep anyone equal at all. These works of art, attempting to make a discussion about social ideas and issues, were a part of an aspect of art at this time called social realism. Artists working in social realism really were not concerned with any of the concerns of the modern artist in design or anything like that. It was more to promote these social ideas. This painting is by Diego Rivera. It's titled The Liberation of the Peon from 1931. We've discussed Rivera before when talking about fresco painting. He was responsible for reviving the fresco arts in the 1920s. This painting is as well a fresco and was commissioned by the Mexican government as a public works program, so to say, to artists so that they could tell in paintings tales of the revolution that happened between 1910 and 1917, espousing the problems with dictatorship and bringing out the problems and plights of the people. Another artist who dealt with social realism was photographer Dorothea Lange. This photograph is the White Angel Bread Line, San Francisco, from 1933. She was also working at the same time as photographer Margaret Bourke White was, and others, documenting the Dust Bowl and other issues dealing with the Depression in America, the lack of food, money, finances, jobs, places to live, very reflective of the times. The text covers 4 artists under the Latin American Modernism category. We will be focusing on just one of those artists, and that is Frida Kahlo. Frida Kahlo does fall under the category of Latin American Modernists, but if you look up any book on surrealism, you'll always find some paintings by Frida Kahlo in there. She was strongly associated with their work, but she was remotely located and not necessarily a part of that movement. On the left, we have a painting of hers titled The Two Fridas from 1939. She was always dealing philosophically with health issues, injuries, the fact that she couldn't bear children. Many of her paintings take on brutal characteristics, a lot of blood, surgery, and other things such as that involved. On the right, we have Self-Portrait with Cropped Hair from 1940. A little bit of commentary on her dealing with bisexuality of herself and fitting in a male-dominated society. Our next movement is American Regionalism, which spanned roughly between the early 1920s to the early 1940s. This is a painting by Edward Hopper titled Nighthawks from 1942. Hopper's concern in his work was conveying a sense of mood from a place in time that's probably really emphasized by the Hollywood films, dealing with film noir and other subjects that were changing at the time in 1940s society. What's also interesting about this particular painting, another version came out later, not by Hopper, but the characters inside of the diner were replaced. Inside there were versions of Marilyn Monroe, James Dean, and Humphrey Bogart, who were all dead Hollywood stars. This painting has become somewhat of a national icon. It's Grant Wood's American Gothic from 1932. The American Gothic commentary is a farmhouse that's built a little bit in somewhat of a Gothic style, but also fits in the period of other subject matter, not necessarily social realism where this is reflecting any type of plight, but it is an example of American rural life in the 1930s. American regionalism can take on many different styles. The one thing that binds all these different styles together from the different artists is the fact that they were portraying American subjects and American stories. This painting is titled Palisades from Thomas Hart Benton. It's from the series The American Historical Epic, which was made between 1919 and 1924. There are several paintings telling the beginnings of America in narrative paintings. In this painting, there's an example of the original European explorers working side by side with the Native Americans to be productive and create a good society. Of course, this isn't necessarily historically true, but it is, in a sense, the American ethic of all of us working together to live better lives. The natives are showing the Europeans how to grow corn, and the Europeans are showing the natives how to build. The next group of artists we'll be looking at are the African American modernists. In the 1920s, there was a call for African American artists to deal more with subjects of African heritage rather than modern big city concerned as other modern artists were dealing with. This particular work is by Sergeant Johnson, titled Forever Free, from 1933. Johnson's concern in representing the African American was not the life of the modern in the city, but more the African American slave type. And the title Forever Free comes from the Emancipation Proclamation. Jacob Lawrence is an artist we've discussed before. He was a part of the Harlem Renaissance movement. Many of the Harlem Renaissance artists were part of community programs sponsored by the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which tried to spread art, music, culture, and literature to the inner cities of America at the time. Jacob Lawrence painted many different subjects, Some of them dealt with the common everyday life of the city people, and others were dealing with African history. This particular painting deals with the liberation of Haiti, which became the first independently ruled nation in Latin America. Archibald Motley Jr. took more of a matter-of-fact view of African American culture in America at the time. This painting was about the speakeasies and music clubs during the time of Prohibition, and the lifestyles, which were not very different than the Americans trying to live the same life under Prohibition at the time. Motley wanted to paint African American life as he saw it, not with any implications of history or any of the other social aspects that go along with that. The last movement we'll be covering in this lesson is organic abstraction in sculpture. Some artists working within organic abstraction were part of the abstraction creation movement. They also had their own manifesto in which they stated they had a total opposition to all oppression of whatever kind it may be, meaning that they were against governmental oppression as well as artistic oppression from within, even with ideas, not necessarily a government trying to tell you what to do, but having to do things a specific way, no matter who says it should be done that way. This sculptural work is by Barbara Hepworth, title forms in Echelon from 1938. They are intended to be abstract, organic plant forms. An artist who was also interested and influenced by pre-Columbian sculpture was Henry Moore. This abstract, organic sculpture is Recumbent Figure from 1938. Moore did many sculptures dealing with recumbent and reclining figures, and many of them were females with children. Here we have the suggestion of human form, but nothing that really overall defines it other than the head and the breasts. But this is typical of his work. Some of these pieces are extremely large. We do have one in the state for public exhibition that's at the New Orleans Museum of Art in their sculptural garden. We are now at the end of our lesson about art between the world wars. Thank you very much for listening.